Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Joy Bowman, Associate Dean in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts and Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I'd like to begin this event by acknowledging that our university community stands on Nonotuck land, and I'd also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and the Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2021 James Baldwin Lecture, Young People Fighting for Climate Justice, a conversation with Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate and UMass alumna and Sunrise Movement co-founder and executive director, Varshini Prakash. The James Baldwin Lecture addresses issues connected to social, economic, and political justice, as well as institutional racism. It was established and made possible with generous support from Dr. Alan J. Davis, a 1968 graduate of the UMass Amherst History Department. Named in honor of the inimitable writer, thinker, activist, and former Five College faculty member, James Baldwin, this lecture is presented by the Department of History, the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, and the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. This afternoon's event is also part of the 2021 Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series. The Feinberg Series is offered every other year by the Department of History at UMass Amherst, thanks to the generosity of alumnus Kenneth Feinberg and associates. Each iteration of the series focuses on a quote-unquote big issue, a topic of clear and compelling concern to society. The series features a wide variety of events, including lectures, exhibitions, performances, panel discussions, and films that invite audiences to consider historical context, analysis, and experience to better understand the topic at hand. This year's Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series is entitled Planet on a Precipice, Histories and Futures of the Environmental Emergency. It seeks to deepen our understanding of the environmental emergency through historical analysis, and in so doing, help us to envision constructive paths forward. For more information about both of these initiatives, to register for future events, or to view audio or video from last fall's events, please visit the Feinberg Series website. Also on the website, you can find a live simultaneous broadcast of this event in Spanish. While you're there, we invite you to also take a look at the list of more than 36 community and university groups that partnered to make this event possible. Today's event also marks the launch of Dreaming the Future, a zine or online magazine by and for young people interested in these issues. It is presented by the Feinberg Series, the Forbes, the Jones, and the Lilly Libraries, as well as the Valley Zine Club. You can find this collection of poetry, art, speculative fiction, and climate justice action plans by local youth on the Feinberg website, where it will be updated on a rolling basis. At this point, I was scheduled to introduce Professor Toussaint Lozier, who was going to introduce our two speakers. As many of you who are watching this probably know, we are in the middle of a climate moment in the form of a nor'easter. And so Professor Lozier has been delayed a little bit, but will be joining us before the Q&A session. But I will say a few words about him in anticipation of his arrival. Professor Lozier is a faculty member in the Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies and a distinguished scholar of Black history and politics, as well as US and transnational grassroots social movements. He has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and a Woodrow Wilson National Foundation Career Enhancement Fellow. He is the co-author of Rethinking the American Prison Movement and is preparing a book manuscript tentatively entitled War for the City, Black Liberation, and the Consolidation of the Carceral State. So we look forward to hearing from Professor Lozier and our speakers during the Q&A. But in the meantime, I will turn this platform over to our first guest, Vanessa Nakate from Uganda. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Vanessa Nakate, and I'm a climate activist from Uganda. I'm happy to be speaking with all of you today. In the year 2018, I remember I wanted to do something that would cause change in the lives of the people in my community and in my country, Uganda. So I started to carry out research to understand the major problems that were affecting the people in my country. I was surprised to find that climate change was one of the greatest threats that was facing their lives. I had been in school and I didn't realize that the climate crisis was such a big threat because in school it isn't taught as a reality that is happening right now, a reality that is affecting people's lives right now. So when I realized that communities in my country were suffering with devastating impacts of climate change, I decided to join the Fridays for Future climate movement and I decided to start striking every Friday for the planet. I started my very first strike in the first week of January 2019, and I guess it's been over 2 years now striking for the climate. Of course, saving the planet is not a very easy journey. There are very many challenges that a person faces, from trolls on the internet to not getting support from friends to not feeling like anyone is listening to you. As a young person from the global south, one of the greatest challenges I've faced in the climate movement, in my activism, has been the feeling of being left out, the feeling of being cropped out. After I attended a press conference in Davos, that was last year in January, and I happened to be cropped out of a photo with fellow climate activists from Europe. It was a very disturbing moment for me, but then it was also a moment for me to see a bigger picture of what the climate crisis really is, of how people from my community are continuously being affected, of how specific groups of people are most vulnerable to the climate crisis, and yet very few people are listening to the challenges that they are facing. We all understand that there is no climate justice without social justice, and there is no climate justice without racial justice. Erasing a photo of a climate activist from the global south means erasing the voices, the cries of all the victims who are being affected by the climate crisis right now. Africa as a continent is one of the least emitters of CO2 emissions, but we clearly see that it is among the most affected by the climate crisis. We have seen terrible impacts of climate change in different parts of the African continent. The southern countries in Africa are facing massive droughts that are leading to water scarcity and leaving people's crops dried up. Where I come from, I have seen changes in weather patterns. I have seen rise in water levels of Lake Victoria that has left farms destroyed, that has left water contaminated, that has exposed children to diseases like cholera, diarrhea. I have seen droughts in the northern part of the country, landslides, name it. What disaster haven't I seen in my country or in the African continent? We have also seen lakes like Lake Chad, its water levels shrinking to a tenth of its original size in just 50 years. The climate crisis is happening right now in the African continent. However, we are the least responsible for what is happening right now. We are at the front line of climate change. but we are not on the front page. Few people are listening to us. Few people care to amplify what is happening in our countries. And it's not just the people from Africa. The people generally from the global south are facing devastating impacts of climate change. We have seen floods that have swept over India during this period of the pandemic. We have seen indigenous communities being abused, indigenous communities being disrespected, and their land being grabbed, and their land being destroyed for the extraction of oil. We have seen oceans being polluted because of the pollution, because of the oil, because of the spills. But who is facing all these challenges? It is communities of people of color. Even when we go to the United States, we clearly see that communities of people of color, they are at the front line of climate and environmental disasters. I cannot say this and forget about the water crisis in Flint. We have seen the Flint water crisis where people, children, were exposed to poisoned water. What is this? This is environmental injustice. To me, climate justice involves people, the planet, and the ecosystem. We cannot run to save the planet without remembering the people who are suffering right now. And if we are to see change, then the change has to include everyone. If we are to see change, then we have to make sure that no specific communities are placed in areas with coal power plants, areas filled with air pollution. As you know that the UK made the first death case that was related to air pollution of a young girl named Ella, which is very sad. Change can only occur when there is justice for all of us. People need to understand that a future that is intersectional is a future that we need. Climate change affects every sector of our lives. I always say that we cannot achieve any sustainable development goal without addressing the issue of climate change. How will you eradicate poverty in countries like mine when climate change is pushing millions of people into extreme poverty? How will you achieve zero hunger across the world when millions of people are being left in dire need of food because their farms are being destroyed, their farms are being washed away by heavy rainfall, their crops are drying up because of the droughts, their crops are being eaten up by locusts. We all possibly know about the locust invasion in East Africa, whereby the locusts ate almost everything that they came across in people's farms, leaving people with a problem of food scarcity. But who came to our rescue? We won't even be able to achieve equality, gender equality, without addressing climate change. It's important for me to say that girls and women are disproportionately affected by climate change in countries like mine. Society has given women and girls roles of getting food, collecting water, and providing for their families. But in the case of climate disasters, girls and women have to walk long distances to collect water in the case of scarcity. They have to work triple in their farms to provide food for their families. Some of the children have to drop out of school, and that is the girls, to help their mothers in providing for their families. Some girls are forced into marriages when their families have lost everything to the climate crisis because they expect a bride price and they know that they are reducing on the number of children at home. What happens to these girls when they're forced into marriages? They're exposed to diseases like HIV, stroke AIDS. They're exposed to diseases like fistula because they are young. They're exposed to unwanted pregnancies. They're exposed to anxiety, depression. Some of them are exposed to suicidal moments. We have to put an end to this. We can't have any more child brides. We can't have any more girls dropping out of school. That's why it's important that we educate more girls for the planet. We need one voice, one platform, and one action to change this world. It all starts with that one person. But then imagine all these voices, all these platforms, all these actions put together. We will be able to transform this world. We will be able to change this world. We will be able to see a better place for everyone. The vision of a just future for me is simply a happy people and a happy planet. To me, that is a just future. Because if a person is happy, that means their rights are being respected. That means they have access to the necessities of life. They can have access to food, access to water, access to shelter, access to medical facilities. They have the feeling of protection and that they can live happily and sustainably for their families. And if the planet is happy, it means our ecosystems are happy. It means the animals are happy. It means everything is happy. To me, that is a just future. Simply a happy people and a happy planet. And with vision, we will know exactly what we want to achieve. This is me right now challenging you to imagine the kind of future you want. What future do you envision? What are you fighting for? What do you want to see in this world? When you have that vision, it will help you fight harder. It will give you the hope to keep speaking up regardless of what happens. To be persistent and consistent in what you're demanding for. Because if you imagine it, then you are able to achieve it. Let us work together. Let us walk towards a future that is happy, a future that is healthy, a future that is sustainable, a future that is equitable for all of us. And if we want to achieve this, then we have to build people, we have to build communities, we have to build our countries. But this is only possible if the people are happy and the planet is happy. That is what I call climate justice. Climate justice is only justice if it is global enough and if it includes everyone. That is part of the bigger picture. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. Wow, that was incredible. Vanessa, I am so deeply inspired by you. I am so grateful for your leadership. I've been following your work for a number of years now and just feel really blessed to be able to share this virtual space with you. And I wish I could hear the applause that I'm sure people are giving you, but sadly, we are not all together. But good afternoon, everyone. My name is Varshini Prakash. I am the executive director for an organization called Sunrise. And we organize young people all across the country towards building a world where exactly that vision that Vanessa just communicated, a world where people can breathe clean air and drink fresh water and live in safety and dignity and belonging. And so I am just really humbled to be here. I'm so happy to be back with my UMass community. I've missed y'all. It's been a few years since I've been around, but it is a place that nurtured and allowed me to grow beyond anything that I ever dreamed of for myself. And so it will always, always be home. And I wanted to start just by telling you a little bit about my story and how I came to be where I am today. And for me, that really starts with my home, with where I'm from. My family, I was born and raised in Massachusetts. I'm living in Boston right now, which is the original lands of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people, where I'm living in Boston. But my family comes from India, and particularly southern India. And it's a place that I had the privilege to visit every few years when I was growing up. And it is a place that is in my blood, and it is my home no matter where I live. And I love it so dearly. I remember just the visiting my grandma's house when I was a kid, and these hearing all these stories from my dad about eating mangoes on the terrace of their little one-room home on the beach, and my dad playing with all these like skinny little Indian kids and his dog Goofy, and all of my grandma cooking me just the most delicious foods. And it was just a place that I loved so dearly. And when I was in 5th or 6th grade, I remember, as many of you might as well, this really horrific tsunami hitting the coast of India, and all across that region. And I remember, watching on my TV screen here in the United States, these 100-foot waves just coming in droves, crashing onto the shores, literally wiping away the face of the earth. And I really didn't like news or politics at that time, but I remember just being glued to my TV screen, watching, like rushing home from school, turning on CNN and seeing this death toll rising, like 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. And just feeling the anguish in my body of these stories of these kids who saw the water receding and went to go grab shells or whatever they could find, and then seeing this wall of water emerging, and the amount of just carnage that emerged as a result of that. And it haunted me at night. And I remember being desperate to do anything to alleviate the pain that I was feeling. And I was, 11 or 12 years old. I didn't really know what my options were. And so my school had this Red Cross donation box in my class where they were gathering supplies to donate. And I just gathered everything that I possibly could, like just cans, and asking my mom whatever we had, and dumping them into this box, and looking down and realizing, like, what the hell was this going to do for the hundreds of thousands of people who were in pain? Like, this is not enough. I am not powerful. I can't save anyone. And that moment just stuck with me of feeling like the scope of the crisis at hand, and my power to do something about it in that moment just not adding up. And I think in that moment, I did what we all do when we feel powerless: just tuck away, ignore, pretend it isn't happening, and move on. But it wasn't long until these stories found me again, or stories that sounded really similar to it. Like in middle and high school, learning about seeing the way that Hurricane Katrina had killed 3,000 people in New Orleans, and the vast majority of those people being Black, being poor, being the elderly. Hearing about the pipelines, the toxic waste sites that went through indigenous territory and tribal lands, seeing the way that emerging floods in Kerala, where my family was from, in India, where 1 million people had to be evacuated last summer, and seeing the way in which kids in Delhi had asthma rates that were just skyrocketing. Just seeing these horrific images and realizing like something was fundamentally wrong, and learning about climate change and the sort of level of economic inequity in the world that has led to the cause of the climate crisis, and that the suffering that was caused by people were often people who lived where I lived in the world, and who made a lot of money off the backs of people who bore the brunt of their greed. And so I think there was this moment, I remember when I was in high school, of realizing there's a lot of suffering that happens in the world that you can't stop, that I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop that tsunami. I couldn't do anything when I was 10 years old, but then there is a lot that you can. And just believing that as in my life, that I have a moral duty and this responsibility to do everything in my power, everything in our power, to build a just and equitable society for as many people as we can. And so I made a choice in that moment, that powerlessness and the sense of feeling small and the sense of what can I do, that wasn't going to hold me back any longer. And I came to UMass Amherst when I was 18, and that was the place where I first fell in love with and was introduced to movements. I took this amazing class called Grassroots Community Organizing, which I don't know if it's still available, but y'all should definitely take that. I started working on a sustainable food program at UMass to figure out how we can actually sustainably grow food and eradicate food deserts where poor folks and people of color don't have access to good, healthy food. And eventually I sort of tripped and fell into this campaign for fossil fuel divestment, which was calling on UMass Amherst to stop investing in the corporations, the fossil fuel industries, the oil and gas and coal companies that were making money off of pushing us ever closer to climate chaos and breakdown that would ultimately lead to the deaths and ruining just hundreds of millions of people's lives around the world. And it was the first time in my life that I actually felt not alone. I felt like I was a part of a movement of people that was, not just me sitting at home, like running after my mom, trying to switch the light bulbs off or whatever it was that I was doing, but joining with other people to ultimately disrupt power structures that exist, ultimately pushing for systemic change, not change of like individuals making consumer choices, but actually change that would shift the entire system that existed at that time to uphold a fossil fuel economy. So right there on UMass's campus, we got like over 5,000 young people to sign a petition calling for divestment. We did tons of marches and rallies. We had negotiations and meetings with school administrators, some of whom were sympathetic, but also some of who I remember this one guy looked me in my face after we shared similar stories to what I've shared here today and said, well, all I care about is making money. And so I think that it was this big lesson in learning, like as students, as young people, we could not rely on those with power to make the changes that we needed out of the sheer goodness of their hearts. It was going to be up to us, up to ordinary kids organizing and turning our individual strength into collective power and standing up to make it happen. And so after years of agitating and organizing, we actually led over 1,000 young people in a week-long sit-in at UMass. And I remember every single day we would be waking up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., coming to Whitmore Administration Building. And every day the lines of people who were there at that sit-in were growing. At first, it was just 20 of us. The next day, it was 40. The day after that, it was 150. The day after that, it was 250 people. And it kept growing over the course of that week. And over 34 people risked and were actually arrested, pushing the administration to change their investment policies. And the last time that had happened at UMass was protests surrounding the end of the South African apartheid regime at UMass. And so, this moment of realizing like, wow, there are so many people who are ready to throw down. And just 1 month later, the UMass Board of Trustees voted to make UMass the first major public university to divest from fossil fuels. And so it was just huge realization, like, we have power. We have power if we get organized, if we are unapologetic in our vision and in our demands. We have power as young people if we can unify across difference. It was really cool to see folks across the spectrum of organizations at UMass coming together around this moment of disruption on our campus. And I think it solidified in my brain something that I knew for so long, and knew deep down in my heart, that we are infinitely powerful if we can come together to make it happen. And so, around this time, this was just at the tail end of the Obama years, and realizing we have won so much, not just at UMass, but around the country. There were trillions of dollars that were divesting from fossil fuels in the US and globally. And that there was this growing grassroots movement that was standing up against the Keystone XL pipeline, led by Indigenous folks and rural communities. We witnessed this Indigenous global resistance that was emerging as a result of the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline for climate justice. We saw the Paris Agreement being signed. We saw some of the first steps towards federal climate policy, but then at the same time, it was abundantly clear we still were not enough, that we didn't have the scale, that we didn't have the power, that our movements weren't growing at the speed and urgency of the crisis at hand. And in order to stop the greatest existential threat of our lifetimes, in order to prevent entire island nations and cultures and traditions from going underwater. And realizing like we need that there were millions of people like us in the United States who didn't actually feel like they had a political vehicle to vocalize their fear and their frustration and begin the fight for a better world. And I think it was this moment of reckoning of right now we are the first generation to feel the deep brunt of the climate crisis. And we will be the last that has the chance to do something significant to limit the carnage that could emerge. And so a number of us began actually dreaming up what would it look like to have a new movement for young people around climate justice. That wasn't just about carbon in the atmosphere or parts per million, but was rooted in addressing racial and economic justice as essential to the path to getting to climate justice. A movement that understood that we had to both engage with politics and that we need our government to actually reflect our values and vision. We couldn't just keep fighting from the outside. A movement that was willing to go to scale and welcome people from all different backgrounds to be included in this movement, not just speaking to a small echo chamber. And a movement that was unabashedly calling for what we needed, not just that was saying yes to what we needed, not just no to what we didn't. That wasn't just saying no to the pipelines and the fossil fuels and the pollution and all of that, but was also saying yes to reparations and redressing harm that has been done to tribal nations and Black communities and poor communities and Latinx communities around this country. That was saying yes to guaranteeing that the right to clean air and clean water and an affordable and clean home were inalienable rights for Americans and people all around the world. That was declaring a solidarity, knowing that the climate has no borders with communities all across the world. And so that was saying that, we can create economic prosperity for people as we're addressing the climate crisis, that we will not leave workers behind, but they will be part of this new economy that we are building. And that we need to fight for that vision through something like a Green New Deal, which you may have heard about. And so we launched Sunrise in the spring of 2017 with that vision to make climate action that is rooted in racial and economic justice a priority in every corner of this country. And that would be one of the best ways that we could actually stand in solidarity with communities across the world and the global South was by coming correct in our homes. And so, that's kind of just where the story starts. And over the last 3 years, I'm just so inspired to say that the movement has exploded. We have brought tens of thousands of youth who have been activated and are organizing their communities. Hundreds of chapters across the country. And we've been throwing down with our friends in the strike movement as well before the pandemic hit. We've been able to elect climate champions to office who are also huge racial and economic justice advocates like Cori Bush or Jamal Bowman or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ed Markey and so many others. And I think, everything that we have seen, the successes that Biden and others that we have declared as victories over the last week, They weren't just because the same story of that administrator in that divestment negotiation. It didn't happen because people woke up one day and decided that that was the right thing to do. It was because young people made a vision of the world for climate justice and moved it from a political impossibility to becoming politically inevitable, because we gave our power holders no other choice. And that is just what I hope you take from this conversation, if anything, is we need you in this fight. We need you to get activated. We need you to throw down. We need this movement to not just be thousands, but millions of people strong, because we are seeing rising hate. We are seeing rising white nationalist and white supremacist violence. We are seeing a worsening climate crisis. We are seeing gun violence. We are seeing so many of the issues that communities have been dealing with, not just for the last 4 years of Trump, but for the last 400. And in order to meet that rising tide of violence and hate, the only thing that can is a rising tide of nonviolent, loving people who are ready to not just sit on the sidelines and avoid the issues at hand, but jump in and help forge a better world in the process. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for the rest of the discussion and appreciate you for listening in.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think this is the, hopefully you hear the sound of applause from folks who are watching, even though we're not able to be in studio or in person together. My name is Toussaint Lathier. I'm an assistant professor at the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies. So shout out again from UMass. Yeah, I just really appreciate Varshney and Vanessa, your comments, and really the time that you took to talk about your own journeys in terms of coming to do this work, and doing so in a way that gave us a sense of your vision, and also the way in which you see climate justice connected to questions of gender justice, racial justice, that deal with the rights of Indigenous people, that are linked very strongly to the circumstances of people in the global South, and really kind of in much of the same way in which you sort of spoke to it, Vanessa, a way of thinking about climate justice that is deeply intersectional. So I wanted to do a couple things. We're going to have a chance for Q&A in a bit of time, but really want to give us a chance to, notify folks about the process for Q&A. So there's a form that you can access via the link on the screen and in the comments. And that link will take you to a document where you can insert the comment, and then we'll do our best to pose as many of those as we can. And while folks are taking the time to share their thoughts, share their questions, one of the things I was very curious about was you all really touched on a lot of ways in which you all came to the work that you do in contending with, as you said, this kind of existential threat of climate justice. And I was most curious, and I wanted to kind of give you all a little bit of space to talk in terms of, perhaps it's obvious, right? Perhaps it's really self-evident, but if you could just speak a little bit about the importance of focusing on mobilizing young people around this issue, because this is one of those questions where, in some sense, climate justice directly impacts the future that young people are gonna see, a world that they're gonna inherit. But there are many ways in which sometimes organizing young people or trying to mobilize young people is seen as this is something that is, an important part of, say, their individual development, or a way in which a certain contingent of young folks can be prepared for the future. And It sounds as if the focus of the organizing that both of you all do sees young people as crucial political actors and as folks who, much more so than those who have come in earlier generations, are at a point in their lives when they can make crucial change. And I just wanted to know if you could just take a moment to elaborate on why the process of organizing and mobilizing young people around this issue in particular is so crucial. And maybe Vanessa, if you could go first and just speak a little bit about, maybe from your own experience, why have you found it so important to tap the capacities of young people, and how is that an important part of maybe helping to get us to the vision we have for a happier and healthier human population and world?
Thank you very much. First of all, I think that young people are not afraid to speak truth to power. They do not sugarcoat what they speak. If there is a challenge, they'll speak it the way it is. If a leader is messing up the planet, young people will say it the way it is. They won't try and sugarcoat it and try and protect probably the image and the social reputation of the leader. They'll say, you are destroying our planet and you have to do this and that to save it. And also, I think young people, they're necessary in participating in the saving of our planet, because it is our future that is at stake. It is the young people who are going to inherit a planet that is either destroyed, or a planet that is safe. It is clear that the past was already messed up. It is also evident that the present is catastrophic. So I think that now is the time for young people to take charge, to try and save what has already been, I would say, predicted for the future. We have seen probably the older generation, if they were doing much, or if they were speaking truth to power, then we wouldn't be striking for climate, or we wouldn't be organizing and putting the right leaders into power like what Vashni is doing. So it's time for the young people to put the right people in place, to put the right changes in place. If the adults are not able to be the adults in the room, then young people have taken up that role to try and clean up the mess.
That's awesome. Yeah, that was perfect. I don't have much to add on that point. Young people have just been a critical part of virtually every major social movement that has existed in, like, at least, US history, I'm sure global history too. And I think we deeply need an intergenerational movement. I don't think that this will get done just because of young people. But I think what young people bring to the table, the passion, the willingness to take risks, the willingness to, the lack of jadedness, the lack of cynicism, the real hope, the militant optimism, like that comes from young people. There's something about being young that just lends itself to that. I'm thinking of Diane Nash and John Lewis and so many of these other leaders who did the Nashville lunch counter sit-ins, who were willing to face being brutalized in order to desegregate the South. Like, I'm thinking about friends that I have in the immigration justice movement who, bravely crossed the border in order to showcase the challenges that exist for undocumented people in this country. I'm thinking of the young folks who are a part of part of the Standing Rock, who are part of Standing Rock, who were some of the first people who actually began the process of standing up to the pipeline construction, to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And, you know, it is always young people who are at the forefront of these movements, like the uprisings that took place around racial justice last summer. A lot of those folks in Minneapolis were young organizers who had been fighting for affordable housing or against white supremacy for a while in their own communities, and were able to organize and get into formation really quickly.
No, definitely. I mean, I appreciate you all's comments, and as a historian, you know, and as someone who's been involved in environmental justice organizing, human rights organizing. You all are making really important points, both in terms of thinking about the current kind of perspective and worldview of young people, and also really this historical role the young folks have played again and again regarding different social movements, and really the brave kind of efforts that folks have taken, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's prior to that. We're talking about, you know, the role of young people in labor organizing, even more recently with kind of earlier waves of environmental organizing and environmental justice. Young people have played a crucial role, and the way in which you all have approached this has been particularly inspiring. Want to again just lift up the Q&A link that's in the comments. We really want to hear what folks who are watching us might be curious about or be interested in. One of the limitations of not being able to be face-to-face is being able to hear and really feel kind of where folks are coming from. So we're going to try to get that as much as possible. I wanted to ask one other question, just from your own perspectives, as young women in particular. How have you seen questions of gender really impacting the way in which we think about questions of climate justice? And in many ways, it's an issue that is not addressed as directly when it comes to the question of climate change and the impacts that climate change has, not just on the general, on the planet in general, but particularly on what we call frontline communities. So those that are really at the forefront of the sort of changes that are taking place in the climate as our current form of pollution and really devastation of the planet continues apace. And maybe Varshini, if you start us off, if you could just talk a little bit about what it's meant to be a young woman in this movement, and if there are any particular ways in which you've seen the questions of gender, questions of patriarchy impacting the way either the movement itself operates, or more broadly, the way in which climate change impacts folks on a day-to-day basis.
This is great. I love this question. I mean, I will say, like, if you go to any social movement, organization, whatever it is, the vast majority of the time, particularly I've seen this in the climate movement, like, women are running this, okay? Like, women, queer folks are running this. And I've seen that in my own organization, where the vast majority of the rank and file people who are showing up, who are throwing down in local chapters, or who are a part of the leadership structure, the vast majority of the people putting in the work tend to be women. And yet the you know, frequently the people who we see uplifted, or and I think this is changing just because of folks like Vanessa and folks like Greta and many other leaders who are emerging and kind of combating this narrative of the people who are getting most of the attention and the focus being primarily male identifying folks. I think the way it's affected me the most is, you know, becoming the executive director of this organization, even having like the audacity to believe that we could create something new and put out something different and you know, inject this vision of the future out into the world and build an organization around it, it has led me to just have to confront face to face so much of my own like imposter syndrome of believing that I'm not smart enough or I'm not powerful enough, like other people know more than me, that I don't deserve to take up space or that my opinion and doesn't matter or shouldn't be heard. And I think this is something that as you get more and more powerful and engage with the power structures that exist, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the media, whether, you know, whatever it might be, within your own organization, it gets a lot more white, it gets a lot more male very, very quickly. And having to sort of work on your own sense of dignity and belonging in rooms like that has been sort of like a lesson and a journey in leadership than something that I ever imagined before. And so I think a lot of where I'm at with it is we have to really be willing, we need to deeply nurture and support and develop the leadership of particularly women, queer folks, and people of color. Like we need to be willing to actually invest in their development and support them in their growth so that they can actually assume these positions of leadership and not just be tokenized in those positions, but can be supported to thrive. And so that's like a big thing that we're thinking about in Sunrise is how do we actually support leadership transitions? How do we invest in folks in a deep way that actually allows them to thrive in leadership positions, not just you know, get into them and then burn out or leave or whatever. And I think that's got to be a big priority for our movements across the board.
Cool. Thank you very much for that. Vanessa, any thoughts in terms of the way in which you see gender and particularly the roles of young women impacting the organizing that you're doing around climate justice? I know you spoke about it earlier in terms of forced marriages and really the sort of unwaged domestic labor that young women do, and in many ways the way in which that work can take them out of school at an early age, and if there are any ways in which you see addressing that linked to the organizing, the activism that you're already doing around questions of climate justice.
Thank you very much. I think speaking from my very first, one of my experiences as a young woman in the climate movement, of course, it hasn't really been a bed of beautiful roses. It has been quite challenging. You find that when I would post maybe a photo of my strike or on the streets or in front of a government building or the parliament, sometimes I would get really, really very nasty comments, you know, someone saying that if you are looking for a man and you're disguising as an activist, then why don't you just become a prostitute or something of that sort? Or why are you wasting your time? Why don't you just go back to school? Or why don't you just get married? So it's really been quite a terrible experience as a young woman in the climate movement, because people always find ways to, I would say, sexualize everything and really attack young women. And also the incident of Davos, where I was cropped out, that still really brought me in the spotlight, and that was positivity from people who are very supportive, and also negativity from people who are out there to say, you're too black, that's why you are cropped out, or your hair was looking this way, or your ugly, that's why you were cropped out. So it has been quite challenging as a young woman, and I've also realized that it's not just challenging in the spaces of activism, but also for young women out in the communities in different parts of the world who are disproportionately affected by climate change, who face challenges of dropping out of school, being forced into marriages, unwanted pregnancies, diseases, and all that. And the feeling of not being empowered and having to, having to choose to be forced to live a life that they don't want to live. And I think one of the ways that we can change this is by educating girls and also empowering women, because I believe that they are tomorrow's leaders, they are tomorrow's campaigners, they are tomorrow's scientists, and they will be able to, speak up in spaces like this. They will be able to stand strong and resilient even when things like this happen. So I think in order to reduce or put an end to the challenges that women and girls face in the case of an occurrence of a climate disaster, then we need more women in decision making rooms. We need more women in rooms where decisions about our planet, about our lives are being made, because this in a way will help them to build more resilient communities since they'll be part of their decision making. This will help them be empowered, not just as individuals who have had an opportunity to go to school, but also benefiting their families, benefiting their communities, and the world at large. So I think that environmental circles need to start embracing one of the social solutions to the climate crisis, and that is educating girls and empowering women, because Project Drawdown lists it as the fifth most powerful solution for reducing CO2 emissions in the atmosphere.
Wonderful. Yeah, I just want to share, our solidarity and support. I mean, it's what you're describing are really difficult circumstances, and unfortunately, we continue to find that sort of harassment and that sort of abuse really can target activists in particular, organizers in particular, but especially young women. And I doubt this is any sort of consolation, but in many ways, a lot of that comes because of the fear that your kind of activism can strike people with, because in standing up in the way that you do, you're not only just challenging, the way we treat the climate, but the way people treat each other, and the particular kind of place that oftentimes African people are assumed to support, people of color are assumed to sort of fit into, women, young people are assumed to fit into. So the way in which you are standing up, you're not just fighting for the climate, but also fighting and challenging those structures of oppression and domination, of stereotypes that are designed to keep us in certain boxes and certain places in society. So hang in there as best you can, and if there's any way in which we can continue to show support and solidarity from abroad, wherever we might be, please let us know. We got a bunch of questions that have been coming in, and there are several that are particularly for young people who are trying to figure out how they can find a place in this movement, that are dealing with some of the same big picture existential questions that you all sort of spoke to. And just bringing together a couple of the questions that have been asked for both of you all. What are some of the specific skills that young people can try to cultivate to be effective participants and leaders in the movement? What knowledge do you think is critical? And particularly, what are the ways in which someone who is a young kid or teenager can do to help their community? What were some of the sort of first things that you look to tell young people when they ask what they can do and how they should start to prepare to be a meaningful contributor to the movement that you all are helping to build? Varshan, why don't you go first?
Cool. Yeah. So one of the things that I would say right away is start, like begin. Whatever you want to do, whether that's fighting on climate justice, whether that's racial justice, whatever your issue that you care about the most is, find a local organization, find maybe a Sunrise chapter, like whatever it is that you want to do, join an email list or whatever you can that is near you and just begin. If you had asked if I was going to end up being the executive director of Sunrise Movement when I was, a decade ago, I would have been like, hell no, that is never going to happen. I don't see that for myself at all. And yet here I am. And in large part, I think that's because I jumped in like 2 feet into movements and put everything that I had into it and just begin. And that is one of the most critical things that you can do, and that you have no idea where that journey might take you. The other thing I would say is investing in finding ways that you can participate in movements, but not like investing deeply in your own sustainability in that process. I have seen so many young people get in and put everything that they have into it, but not also deeply invest in their own sustainability while they're doing that work. So whatever work you need to do on the side that builds resilience, that allows you to engage in tough conversations with people, get into conflict, navigate the terrain of organizing work, which can be fraught because so many people are coming from so many different parts of the country and your community on this, is investing in your own resilience and making sure that you have a sense of both stability and the capacity to give to the work are also something that has absolutely been critical for me.
Vanessa, any thoughts in terms of advice that you have for young people who are trying to find ways to take climate change from something that they might just worry about and see as this sort of big looming problem, and instead try to shift to figuring out how they can be part of the solution to the problem? What do you tell young people who ask you how they can get involved, and what are some skills or knowledge that they should try to focus on in terms of how to best be a useful contributor to the sort of work that you all are already doing?
Well, that young people are asking this question, it shows that you are passionate. It shows that you desire to change this world and make it a better place. So, like Vashni said, just begin, yeah, just begin. But to give you an example of how I began, I did so much research because I knew less about the challenge of climate change. So I took time to educate myself by reading articles online to try and understand what climate change really is, what global warming really is, and what leaders are doing about this. So I think it's important to be in the place of learning from those who have been there before you, because I remember watching and listening to speeches of young people who have been doing climate activism before me. So it was also a very good moment for me to learn from them, to understand the work that they're doing, and to know exactly what I'm getting into and why it's important for me to do the activism. And I think that it's also important to remember that whatever action you take is important. Understand that it can make a difference. Many times we feel like our actions cannot make a difference because it's probably just in your community, in your society. But then imagine you are doing that action and another person is doing another action. So if we put together all these actions and just add them up, you realize that there are millions of actions that are going to transform this world. So just remember that no one is too small to make a difference, regardless of who you are, regardless of where you come from, regardless of what school or what you have studied. So just begin and try as much as possible to learn from those who have been there, who have been doing this, and yeah, just find a local activist group that you can work with. For example, for the Fridays for Future, there are different kinds of groups. There are quite a number of groups, in different countries. So just find any local group. Could be Fridays for Future, could be the Sunrise Movement, could be the Rise Up Movement. Just try and see that you be part of this solution. It's time for all of us to be part of the solution and make this world a better place.
Word. Appreciate that. Thank you. Oh man. Y'all are I wish it wasn't snowing outside because y'all make me want to go out and like do some door knocking or something. And that I do want to ask at some point, we did have a question about how you all look to take action, especially with the current pandemic that we're dealing with. What are some of the ways in which you found ways to kind of pivot and still be effective in terms of the work that you're doing? But I did want to, before we go to that, I did want to touch on a question that we had from Ashwin. He had a two-part question that touches on some other kind of lines of questioning that other folks have advanced. For you, Vanessa, Ashwin was interested if you had any books, author, or article recommendations about the climate justice movement or climate politics in East Africa, or really Africa as a whole, and any suggestions in terms of where folks can go to learn more about the work that you all are doing in Uganda or any other parts of the continent. And then for Varshni, for us in the U.S., do we need to think about climate, and this is again part of Ashwin's question. We need to think about climate policy and politics internationally, which means repairing the harms that colonialism and empire have done. Is Sunrise advocating for canceling the debt of countries like Uganda immediately and demanding massive funding from the U.S. to pay for climate mitigation and adaptation in countries like Uganda? If so, how can we boost this? Bernie called for several $100 billion, but even that isn't enough. What's Sunrise concrete vision for international solidarity? And in many ways, that sort of touches on other questions that folks have raised regarding how do we integrate an analysis of race or the legacies of colonialism and the ongoing dynamics of racial capitalism into our work, particularly when it comes to centering people of color in the global South. But if you could just hold for a moment, and maybe Vanessa, if you could give us any suggestions in terms of how to learn more about the climate struggle in East Africa and in Uganda. What are your suggestions?
Thank you. For the to learn about the climate activism in my country, in East Africa, and also in East Africa, sorry, there are quite a number of accounts that I would, recommend. There are many young people who are doing a lot to address these issues and demand for justice. For example, the Rise Up movement, which I started, I work with different young people across Africa to try and, amplify the voices of every activist, and to try and bring out their message, to try and talk about what countries experience specifically in Africa, because you may find that what I experienced in Uganda is not what someone in South Africa is experiencing. So that is one of the ways that you can follow up some of the work that we are doing. There is also Fridays for Future Uganda on Twitter. There is 1 million activist stories. That is one of the initiatives that I started with a fellow activist, Davis Ruben Sekama, and basically we started this initiative during the pandemic, since we could not do the physical strikes. So we would do like interviews of different activists and share their work on the blog. So you can also find more of that on the 1 million activist stories. And also on my personal account, I usually share what other activists are doing. I think that is also another way that you can find out what different activists are doing across the African continent. Yeah. And about the articles, I do not have like specific titles, but then there are quite a number of articles that talk about these challenges. I always focus more on the articles that really explain the impact of the climate crisis in the African continent, because most of the people in Africa, they do not know about this challenge, because you find someone saying, why are you fighting for climate justice? And yet many people are probably struggling to get jobs. Many people are struggling to get out of poverty. So it's through these articles that we are able to learn more and able to teach more young people, more people in communities about what is actually happening on ground, and how the unemployment, the poverty is all connected to the climate disasters.
Nice. That's awesome. So on the question, well, just before I get to the question of international solidarity, something that Vanessa said sparked this for me too, around just like specific ways that young people can get involved. And I just want to give you an example. Like we did a ton of electoral work in the last cycle, and we were able to get folks like Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman elected in large part because teenagers on Zoom were organizing other teenagers to make hundreds of thousands of calls for progressive candidates. And when I say teenagers, I mean like I was joining phone banks where the trainings were held by 2 13-year-olds. Like I was attending events online that were hosted by like 15-year-olds. There is no limit to what young people can do. And I think like that is also the thing that helps me cut through a lot of the despair and the challenge there, is realizing like, what am I doing being sad? They're like teenagers who are ready to go right now. And we need to make sure that they feel empowered to do that. And so through Sunrise, we have like a high school and middle school program that we're working with. We're also working to create programs specifically for Black young people, Latinx young people, and young people who organize in rural or red communities. And so that's something to also look out for. I think part of this, like when I joined, I didn't exactly make the right step or fall into Sunrise right away, but it was a journey of just engaging with one thing. Okay, it was like recycling, then it was like sustainable food, then it was divestment, then it was Sunrise, and just consistently being willing to take risks and do the next thing to keep the movement moving forward. And so that's just a word on that last question. I love the international solidarity question, and I think it is an extremely good one, and actually the place where I think the Green New Deal and Sunrise have fallen the most short. I think in large part, this is not an excuse, it's just an explanation. I think part of this was, one, American politics, both on the left and the right, has been so focused on America first, actually before Trump came into office, that it has actually infected most of our movements and our organizing as well. And so this has been a big realization for us as we're coming on the like 2-year mark of the Green New Deal kind of like emerging in a big way in American politics, though many of the ideas of the Green New Deal have been around for forever. And I think there's, so we're currently in the process of basically creating a new strategy for Sunrise for the next 5 years, and really want internationalism and a sense of international solidarity to be part and parcel of it, especially because, some of the biggest stories last year were about the Amazon or about the fires in Australia or so on. Like people are affected. We're in this broader web, and people are affected by the issues that impact people around the world, even if we are, limited by borders and things like that. And so I think if you have ideas on this, would love to hear it. You can submit them through the Q&A as we're considering this. I'm also hoping, I'm going to make a plug to Vanessa to have a call after this webinar to talk about actually how we can build that up, and not just have it be cities and countries in the global north talking to one another, but actually make this a solidarity in the global south with countries in the global south as well. And so I think we're in a real defining phase around what international solidarity looks like for Sunrise, and needing it to be many of these things that you mentioned, Ashwin, around actually paying up for supporting other countries to transition, given the United States' historical culpability with how much carbon is in the atmosphere and pollution.
Word. And I appreciate your humility in terms of saying that, this is something that folks in Sunrise can do a better job of, and is sort of a growth edge, both in terms of the work that we're doing right now, and also how we're framing policies like the Green New Deal. And, in my work with groups that do organizing around questions of militarism and questions of the war, they're constantly reminding me of the fact that the U.S. military is the largest polluter in the world, and how that role that the U.S. military and its links to the broader military-industrial complex play in terms of negatively impacting the climate is also deeply connected to questions of war and peace at home and abroad. Well, I really want to thank you all for taking the time to engage with us here through the computer, through our various different online platforms. I mean it not just in a sort of perfunctory way, but I really think it's deeply important that we have these kind of conversations. And you were saying that both of you all were speaking to instances where folks have been taking the time to really not just sit at home and kind of observe what's taking place, whether it's on television or through social media or what have you, but actually sort of dig in and get involved. And I think these are exactly the sort of conversations we need to be having in terms of finding ways to dig in and get involved, particularly around the issue of climate justice, because oftentimes I think, and this is reflected in some of the questions, we're told that this is an issue that we can't do that much about, at least us as individuals. And there's very little that can happen. And I think the work that you all are doing is such an important reminder, such a vital reminder that each of us can take action on a daily basis to fight for the sort of climate, to fight for the sort of future that we deserve and the generations coming after us deserve. So I just want to express my deep gratitude to you all for your inspiring work, and want to offer our support however we can in terms of helping to really push forward what you all are doing. And this particular conversation, I think, is very vital. In my own experience, part of my introduction to the work of climate justice was through the environmental justice movement and the way in which folks who were fighting against environmental racism were at a point where they were trying to make connections not only to the way in which the impacts of Hurricane Katrina connected to the devastation of Cancer Alley in Louisiana, connected to the pollution that had been left over from industrial production in places all across the United States. But we're also doing that in conversation with folks from South Africa or Nigeria, and really trying to make these deep connections between the way in which the dynamics of the sort of disproportionate burden that our people have to bear because of the way in which the climate is taken advantage of is really a global phenomenon. So I want to take a moment to close us out. Thank you all. If you all want to just come off mute and just address the audience, and if there's any last piece of information in terms of what you might want to share in terms of how folks can follow your work, please take a moment to do so. Maybe Vanessa, if you could go first since you're already off mute, and then Varshini, if you could close us out.
Well, thank you so much for having us here and for amplifying the work that we are doing through this platform. I really appreciate it. And I think that we shouldn't just end at this conversation, especially for those who have been watching or listening. I think that this is a moment for us to think about what we are going to do, to think about how we are going to use our voices, to think about how we are going to use our platforms, to think about how we are going to use our resources for the people on the planet. And all of us are needed if we want to see a future that is sustainable and equitable for all of us. So let's not just end at this lecture. Let us actually do something starting now.
Yes, I totally agree. And oh, she's still talking. Sorry, it cut out for me. Okay. And yes, exactly. And so, I mean, I would say follow Rise Up Movement, follow Sunrise Movement. You can find us on every channel that you would think of. You can go on our website and sign up. I just super encourage you all. There are so many different ways that you can participate in the movement. If you're like, protesting, not really for me, that's chill, totally fine. You can knock doors and talk to your neighbors about the issue in a way that is COVID safe. You can donate on this issue. You can make calls from your home. You can, write op-eds and letters to the editor. You can use whatever. What we need is for every person to utilize their unique set of skills towards the end of achieving a world that is more just and equitable. And like whatever your gift, whatever your talent, whoever you are, whatever you're good at, like think about how you can put that into the effort of stopping the climate crisis. And I just feel really, again, just want to say thank you, Dr. Lussier. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, UMass. I'm just really humbled to be a part of this event and so grateful for all your work in your respective areas.
Brilliant. Thank you all, and much appreciated to the folks who helped make this possible. And thanks to everyone who took the time either to watch us live or hopefully getting a chance to catch this recording. And hope to see you in the streets or on social media or knocking on doors with your neighbors or making phone calls or doing whatever small piece of what is required you're able to do to help us get us to the vision of the world that we deserve and the future that we want for ourselves and for the generations to come. Thank you.